Hotel, welcome to another day of Journey in the Self. I'm your host, Sarah. Tonight we have a very powerful show about what could be considered a controversial topic, but a topic that needs to be dealt with. I felt compelled to do this show despite the fact that this is primarily a spiritually based show, but I feel as though we have to strike a balance between dealing with spiritual issues and also dealing with issues that we have to deal with from a day-to-day basis, because we do live in the world, and so it's for us to apply the spiritual principles in order to be able to navigate the world successfully. And so we wanted to deal with a topic that has become very prevalent and has been in the media as of late, as we've seen the football player for the Baltimore Ravens, Ray Rice, be suspended, and the controversy over the spousal abuse, and also the uproar that was created by comments made by Stephen A. Smith on ESPN. With us tonight, I have Brother T. Hasan and Professor Dr. T. Hasan Johnson, who is received his PhD in Cultural Studies from Claremont Graduate University in the summer of 2007. He is also a 2006 Ford Dissertation Diversity Fellow and currently teaches at Pittsburgh College in the Intercollegiate Department of Black Studies and the International Intercultural Studies Department. He also teaches at Cal State University Domingos Hills in their Africana Studies and Social and Behavioral Sciences Department. My interest was piqued because Dr. Hasan had wrote an article about the Stephen A. Smith's discussion on his show, and his article was Stephen A. Smith right? The domestic abuse of men. And with Stephen A., for people weren't privy to his conversation, though he pointed out that there is no excuse for the physical abuse of women, but he suggested that there is some provocation that also needs to be dealt with. So, my feeling was that in looking at that, you have to look at the whole perspective, not again to exonerate someone for physically abusing women, but also to look at the other aspects of abuse, which also include verbal abuse, to which many men are subjected to. And there's also some physical abuse that goes on from the opposite perspective, from females onto the males, which then can provoke. So we want to discuss that this from a holistic standpoint. And so with that, I want to bring in Dr. Hasan Johnson to let him express his views on the issue and why he wrote the article. Brother Hasan.
Oh, it's good to talk to you, brother, and thank you for the invitation.
Indeed.
I'm currently, I just wanted to add real quick, I'm currently teaching at Fresno State in the Africana Studies Department. So I've been here for a little while, and since I've been here, I started to focus more of my research on gender. The last decade of my doctorate, I spent a good deal of time focusing on gender in regard to women. But what I've come to find is there's a whole area of gender that's still not talked about, even in these classes at the graduate level, and that's the experiences of men and boys, be they straight, gay, or bi, or whatever other designation. Males are still not discussed when we talk about gender. So that's something I started to delve into, and one of the areas that tripped me up was when I got to abuse. and it was almost accidental just kind of looking at it. But I was curious about a male abuse and where it stood and so on and so forth. And as I got deeper into it, I found that it's really quite prevalent. It's really quite prevalent, and it's happening across the board. But there are a number of reasons why we don't hear very much about it. So when this Ray Rice issue came up, Stephen A. Smith talking about it, I thought, well, let me chime in a little bit just to try and provide some balance. Which, Brother Sarah, when you mentioned the spiritual purpose of this discussion, that was the first one that came to mind for me. The need for balance, the need for context so that we can understand what we're dealing with. For men, most of us don't really have an idea of what male abuse looks like. And for the larger society, when we say domestic abuse, when we say domestic violence, when we say rape, the first thing that comes to our mind are women. And that's because we've made the whole issue of gender about women, but it's actually larger than that. And the whole male side of it needs to be brought into the discussion badly. So the article you mentioned was Stephen A. Smith Wright, dealing with domestic abuse of men, can be found at newblackmasculinities.wordpress.com. And you can look at the article there.
Okay, and I would definitely encourage people to read that article, because I feel like the article does bring a balanced perspective to the issue. So I found it interesting. You mentioned in your comments that when the discussion is of gender in gender studies, even though gender is male and female, you pointed out how it's typically just viewed from a female perspective. Why do you
Absolutely.
think that is?
Well, it's a product of the feminist movement more in particularly. So the 1960s and 1970s, the whole discussion about gender and really domestic abuse came about from women activists who were saying, look, we have these women who are being battered. They have no place to go. They're not being supported. And they were absolutely right. The problem, or I should say the difference between the issue of women and men in regard to domestic abuse is men really didn't have a movement in that same kind of way. So this whole discussion about gender and how it impacts our lives was brought about by women activists mainly. And men, kind of tried to navigate it, some better than others in terms of what this whole issue meant. But there still wasn't an accompanying male movement that actually said, hey, look, okay, there's some experiences that need to be put into context with men. We didn't really have that. So to this day, when you say gender, like I teach university level, and if I walk up to a student and I say, hey, there's a class on gender I want you to take, well, the first assumption of the person I'm talking to is this is a class on women. And that's kind of where that comes from. So the lack of a movement in that sense is really what undergirds it. But the issue of violence is one that's become so prevalent that we don't even recognize it. I mean, if you watch television or if you watch films, heck, when I was writing the article, I was watching a child's cartoon. And as I was writing it, this woman kicked a guy through a wall and kicked him in his privates, and he fell to the ground holding himself. And it was supposed to be funny, And as I was writing, it struck me how common violence is against males, particularly from females. Now, it's interesting when we see two males fighting. It's funny when we see a female fighting a male, but it's abuse when we see a male fighting a female. And that political shift right there, we have to start taking into account, because in my estimation, along with alcoholism, drug use, and a need for counseling, maybe even psychiatry, the reasons behind female violence toward males is partly because in our media culture, we've made it funny. It's not to be taken seriously. If she throws something at you or attacks you or something, it's likely to be taken not only as funny, but you did something wrong or he did something wrong. Those are the two ways that you hear it discussed. Like if you ever watched The View after they talked about Jay-Z and Solange in the elevator, one of the prevailing responses to that was he must have done something to her. You know what I mean? And that in and of itself is a problem because it doesn't call into attention the behavior. It focuses on what he did, and there's already a kind of blame narrative put into place, and that's extremely dangerous. So we really want to get at the heart of this. And when I listened to Stephen A. Smith talk about it, one of the things I noticed is, he really had a hard time. He was stumbling through it. He was trying to make sure he didn't say anything incendiary, and he did anyway. And really all he said was, there are those that contribute to it. And that, of course, blew up and became an issue. But part of what I saw in that is that most of us men don't know how to talk about gender because this has not been something we've been included in, but I urge men to actually sit in these gender discussions and make a place for men's experiences, males' experiences. But anyway, as far as what I was saying in terms of pop culture, the violence against men is common. And if you really start to pay attention and just watch the movies and the films, especially the ones your kids are watching, you'd be surprised to be able to look at just how much vitriol and anger you can see expressed at men that's dismissed as comical or invisible. So that's the other part of it. It's either funny or it's invisible. But those, there has to be some other options, and we have to be able to say it publicly in order to have a conversation about what this looks like. The other issue with that is many men are not going to come forward when it comes to abuse or rape. And a lot of that has to do with the culture of masculinity that we have. We're told as men, you're supposed to suck it up and bear it. You're not supposed to come forth with it. And if you do, you're really just complaining. You're really just not being a man. You're being a simp, so on and so forth. And so with that kind of culture in place, a lot of men are not going to come forward, and a lot of boys as well. I've worked with boys from 9 to their late teens, and I'm dealing with boys who have been raped. I'm dealing with boys raped by males and females, and the problem they've had coming forward is they're not taken seriously. I mean, I've had some boys that were laughed out of police stations, and so it's this kind of space we need to be able to move in as males to say, look, this is important and it needs to be dealt with.
Let me ask you this. Do you think that the fact that since it is perceived and is actually a fact that in general men are stronger than women, and because of the public perception that a man responding or acting in a physical manner against a woman is a negative phenomenon, that in and of itself empowers the woman, because the male then perceives that if he responds in a physical manner, that he will be looked upon negatively, and so therefore will not respond. Do you think that gives the woman, the female, a sense of empowerment in knowing that that person is not going to react?
I think so. I mean, I think there have been experiences with that, as well as understanding that, if it goes to court and you're 280 pounds and 6'3", and she's 110 pounds and 5'1", when you say she's abused me, you're not really going to be taking it seriously. And I think there are those who take advantage of that. I wouldn't at all say that all women do, no, but there are definitely some that have. But one of the things I try to tell males about that is, in terms of taking it seriously, I don't care how strong you are. There's not much you can do if someone attacks you in your sleep. You know what I mean? If you're in the right situation with a weapon, there's not much you can do. There's not much you can do if you're attacked by a group of people that have been sent by a woman who's frustrated with you. If you're thrown a pot of hot grease, or as we know with Al Green, some hot grits.
Hot grits, right.
And we also have to keep in mind that abuse is not just physical. And this is where the rates of abuse get difficult to trace. There's about 835,000 acts of violence, physical violence from women to men every year in an intimate setting. meaning in a relationship. But that doesn't count psychological violence and emotional violence, which is gendered in different ways. So if I, for example, and this is just, off the head, if you got a couple that's having difficulty producing a child, and a man begins to talk to his girlfriend, his wife, or whatever in derogatory ways about how she can't produce a child, that's emotional and psychological abuse.
Right.
But it's gendered toward her. But that can work the other way around too. It works differently. If you take that same couple and instead of him chastising her, she chastises him about not being able to get her pregnant. He's less than a man. He's a wimp. He's a punk, so on and so forth. Those kind of words, impotent, those are words that are gendered at men in very particular ways. And that can serve as one example of psychological or emotional abuse. So when you add those to the physical abuse, people would really be shocked as to how common it is. But again, as long as you can kick a man in the nuts on television and people laugh, nobody's really going to take it seriously. So what I try to get people to do is imagine the reverse. See, on the article that we're talking about, the Stephen A. Smith piece that I wrote, at the bottom I have an exercise where there are about 5 different video clips of men being attacked by women. And I challenge the viewer, can you watch this without laughing? Can you imagine if the genders were reversed? Would it be funny if he kicked her in the groin? Would we stand back and laugh at that? When you try and open that discussion up, people can really begin to see just how serious it is.
Let me interject as well. One of the things that came to mind as you were speaking was the imagery that came from the movie The Color Purple. And that was in that setting. You had, and I saw a lot of feminist attitude in the way that movie was portrayed. But in that, you had the male figure abusing the woman, but the highlight of the movie was the female exacting revenge against that abuse. And so it seems to me that type of mentality has been permeated in the media, particularly with respect to African Americans, and champion the woman who then rises up and either exacts revenge or initiates violence against men.
Yeah, and it can be a kind of a complicated issue because on the one hand, there's a whole realm of literature and film that came about really in the 1980s, late 1970s and 80s that represented, women, black women in particular in the black community whose stories weren't being told, right, in terms of abuse. And part of that went back to the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement. And the idea was telling these stories is going to make it hard for us to push for rights. And that's a problem because that meant that there were a lot of black women that did not, that were not able to get their stories out, and they weren't taken seriously, even by the law.
True.
Now, the other side of that, though, is now it's become commonplace to show violence. In other words, it's become commonplace that if a woman responds with violence, she's justified in doing so if a couple of things have happened. If a man has cheated on her or abused her, right? And so in that, if you've cheated on your woman or if you've abused her and she responds by throwing some hot grits on you, it's now a celebration moment. Well, that becomes a bit of a problem because even with Ray Rice, one of the things that, was kind of being put out there was that his then fiance, who apparently he had punched, said that she had struck him first. Well, okay, if a man struck a woman because she cheated on him or because she had been abusing him, is that justified? Well, most people would say no, but somehow it's acceptable when the tables are turned. He must have done something. He deserved it. Well, this is a problem. I don't care if it's from a male or female or a trans person. If there's violence, we need to make sure we avoid it ourselves. If someone comes at us in an intimate setting with violence, we need to actually, and I'm a heavy advocate of this, if you can, leave.
Absolutely.
Do not respond with violence. It's not acceptable. And then if need be, bring in the law if it has to go there. If you cannot get there with discussion, if you cannot bring in a pastor or an elder or a family member, you go, if you need to bring in the law, do so. And that's for a couple of reasons. One, because we don't want to perpetuate violence. We don't want people getting hurt. But two, because, again, if it does go to court, men are going to find themselves in a very precarious situation, even if they're innocent. So, my argument to men is if you're attacked violently, especially by a woman, don't respond with violence. Leave the situation if you cannot talk rationally through the situation, but don't respond with violence. And I say in turn to women the same thing. The only thing I would add in regard to women in violence is this, as you said, with the color purple and these other things that celebrate that violence as inspirational. That's problematic.
Indeed.
That's problematic.
Now, you raised a point about, the different levels of violence. You talked about, physical violence, but also there is, verbal violence or verbal abuse,
sure.
Which, is just, which can be extremely hurtful. Maybe not as hurtful as physical abuse, but it is damaging psychologically. And you mentioned, and I can even, as you were talking about, how the court system deals with things, I think we shared off the air that I know a brother who I ended up being a character witness on his behalf because his wife had accused him of physical abuse when, in my observation, and I've known them for 20 years, both of them, I've always seen her in verbal abuse against him and have never seen him react. So I know, from a character standpoint, that he was not engaged in physical abuse against her. In fact, he even had eyewitnesses who saw her confront him physically. But he was then having to defend himself in court. But, talk about the effect, as you did a bit, in the beginning, about the effect of verbal abuse that can have on an individual.
Well, that can be extremely powerful, and a lot of us, we may dismiss it when we think about men being verbally abused by women, but I think a lot of people have a better idea about what it looks like when it's men verbally abusing women, and that can range from anything from calling someone out their name, right, calling them derogatory names that are not theirs. Or it can range from dealing with private personal information, making private information public in a derogatory kind of way. So if you're in a public setting and you decide to talk about how your male partner isn't good in bed, or how he doesn't pay the bills, or how he doesn't meet your satisfaction in those kind of very intimate ways, that can be easily an example of verbal abuse. It can be, and it doesn't have to be in public, but that's just a more extreme example of that. And that can have an impact emotionally on somebody, because there are many men, and I would argue far more men than those that physically abuse, but there are many men that will not respond with violence, but don't know where to go with that frustration. You know what I mean? And just really internalize it. And any kind of toxic negativity that you internalize is going to have a damaging impact on you, on yourself, emotionally, psychologically. And I know this is a spiritual program, so we can even talk about the physical impact of internalizing negative energy. All of those things can contribute to that. And we see it most blatantly in, it can be anything from weight gain to blood pressure, and black males and blood pressure. Unfortunately, high blood pressure go hand in hand. Most black males have some serious difficulty with that over the age of 40. And these kinds of stresses definitely add to it. And what makes it that much more impactful is that we don't often have a name for it in the black community. You can't go to anybody and say, she's talking to me in this kind of way and it hurts me. I mean, even other men will look at you like, well, you got to, suck that up. This is what it is. But that's part of the problem. We don't know how to talk about it, and we don't have a space for that, but we need to.
Yeah, and before you go into that, and that's an exceptional point that you made about having a forum to be able to discuss that. But you mentioned something which it seems to be a larger issue in terms of the black community. There seems to be a very strong movement to demasculate the black man. And we know, from its history that has occurred since slavery, and that has gone on from the media standpoint as well. And the things that you were talking about in terms of the inclination for some women to engage in that type of demasculating talk, where he's impotent, he can't perform in bed and so forth. That is fed from the media to compel a further demasculation of the black man.
Well, absolutely. And before I go on there, I wanted to say one last thing about verbal abuse, and then I'll talk about emasculation. If anybody's ever seen the show Amos and Andy, the old show, if anybody remembers the stereotypical character of the Sapphire, right? Which we can actually see updated in the Tyler Perry Medea stereotype or whatnot. That kind of person is the type of, that's an extreme example of what verbal abuse, emotional abuse can look like. Someone that's tearing you down verbally but never puts a finger on you. Mm-hmm. That's an example of that. And I wanted to just give people an image. It is a stereotype. I'm not arguing that all women are like that by any means, but I am saying that is what it can look like. But as far as what you're saying about emasculation, you're definitely right, because what we're looking at when we talk about the black community and gender, we have a very interesting discussion that few people really want to get into, and that is that African masculinity and African femininity were disrupted by slavery. Mm-hmm. The transatlantic slave trade, among a wealth of other things. We can talk about it on any level, but when we talk about it in terms of gender and gender roles, our sense of it was dramatically disrupted. Now, those of us brought to North America experienced a very particular disruption, because on the plantation setting, the prime example of masculinity was the slave owner. Mm. The slave owner controlled the property. The slave owner determined who got to live there. It didn't matter if you married someone or had a child with someone or just really cared for your mother or father. The slave owner got to decide whether or not you were sold or could stay. Well, this became the example of masculinity in the West. And black men ever since have been up against that example of masculinity. Not only the standing of whites in society, but the particular power of white males in society became the example of masculinity. So part of seeing black men emasculated in media is funny and amusing to most, but it really comes out of a program of making sure that in the black community, we don't have a sense of what strong masculinity looks like. Now, we can point to black men throughout history that have demonstrated this, but there's always been a cost, right? Mm-hmm. So we look at Malcolm X, El-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz. We look at Dr. Martin Luther King, and these are examples among many. We can go to Garvey, we can name among many who stood up. But what happened to them? You know what I mean? It wasn't accidental that they were assassinated, and there were a number of reasons behind this, but one of them is that the example of masculinity that is unbending, unyielding, and yet loving and supportive of the community has to be dismissed and buried under the rug.
Absolutely.
You cannot have a strong sense of masculinity and a clear idea of what it means to be male, female in the black community without it having an impact. And so it's in that way that our examples are often gone. Now, we also can talk about those in our families that stood up, but anytime I've sat down with black folk and asked them about those examples of masculinity, there are stories that come with it. Mm-hmm. You know, I have a grandfather that was an example of standing up in the South against racism. And there was one particular occasion when he did so, but he knew within 24 hours he had to get out of Texas, and he's never gone back. Those kind of examples exemplify the hostility at masculinity that still goes on. And now through our media, it's such commonplace to see black men emasculated that even black boys growing up in this media believe that that's what it's supposed to be, right? That joke, that construction of emasculated masculinity is real, and it isn't. But this is the culture we live in, and it is violent against black maleness.
Indeed, I can recall some, even some personal experiences, and I'm sure that most black males can relate to having a situation similar, in that you might be riding out with your woman and being pulled over by the police, and having the police basically emasculate you in front of the woman and trying to provoke you into something, but knowing that you cannot respond. And just, I think there was even, was that movie Traffic, I believe it was. There was a scene in, where that exact circumstance occurred. And, and left the brother, just really psychologically decimated. So, your point is extremely well taken. But yeah, so before I had interrupted, you were going on and speaking about, the fact that black men lack a forum to be able to discuss these things, and and so having not know where to turn, as you pointed out, it could lead to physical stresses like high blood pressure, or compel someone into substance abuse and so on.
Absolutely.
So speak on that a bit.
Well, I mean, we try and find escape in all kinds of ways, and anything taken to an extreme becomes dangerous. So whether you're talking about alcohol or drug use, or whether you're talking about food, or an overall escape from life. I can't tell you how many boys I've had over the years that live in video games, that live in abstract spaces where they disconnect from life. And these can actually be very young men that cannot always articulate for you what they're dealing with, but have a very strong sense that they are not welcome in the world that they've been prepared to join. They know that they don't have a space. Jobs are few. The unemployment rate in our community has always been higher than in the mainstream community, but especially after this recession that we've experienced. Black males know an incredibly high, unemployment rate. So in terms of education and in terms of unemployment, you see people disconnecting in all kinds of ways. And drugs and alcohol is definitely one of the most dangerous routes to go, but it can be in other ways that we think are fine. As I said, food, video games, television, movie, anything that distracts you from actually dealing with reality can become a problem. And we find ourselves trying to escape into a lot of those spaces. What we need to be able to do is face them head on. We need to be able to form unions with other men who I call safeguards, right? Other men that you can communicate with about these issues, and actually build groups. But these groups don't have to be large-scale organizations. I, of course, applaud that. But they could just be 5 or 6 people that you meet with on a regular basis. And what that does is it does a couple of things. One, it lets you know that you're not crazy. And it gives you a chance, especially if you bring in older men, black men in particular, it gives you a chance to receive some guidance about what some alternatives are to dealing with your situation. You know what I mean? Because they've lived it, they've been there. Those kind of discussions can open that up. So at Fresno State, I started an organization called Onyx, the Black Male Collective, and we have 17-year-olds to 70-year-olds that meet once a month and have these critical closed doors discussions. And I'm talking about young and old men in tears, breaking down some of the things they're dealing with, and getting support and advice from one another. Most of us don't do that. As men in the West, we've been raised in a culture of individualism, right? Part of your manhood is being able to stand alone. Now, there is a truth to that, because often we may not find the support we need, and you do have to be able to stand on your own. But the downside of that is when we push that philosophy too far and we don't know how to build support with others, that becomes toxic. So we do have to reach out. We do have to try and build support mechanisms, and we have to be able to try and get these discussions going so men can participate, particularly black men can participate in these discussions more fervently, because we need it.
Indeed. Now, you made a point, which I thought was important about having support groups, but you also pointed out, how the perception that reaching or needing help is not a masculine idea. That it's to go solo is to be a man. But is that not a Western paradigm? Isn't it a tradition in the African culture to have men's groups and to have that type of discussion that you had suggested?
It is, and unfortunately, there's so many aspects of our culture and tradition that we've forgotten about. And some of it has just been direct oppression, but some of it are things that we got rid of trying to meet this Western idea, trying to embody it and live by it, and not realizing how much of it is toxic and problematic. But men did get together, and as a matter of fact, you had an initiatory school in many different African communities, particularly in West Africa, but all over the continent, where men would actually prep younger men for manhood. And I always tell my students this, an African male in the 14th century had a much clearer idea of what his role was by the age of 14 than a 40-year-old man does today in the black community. A much clearer idea of what his masculinity meant, what his job was, and how he was to interact. What even were the standards of behavior? We don't have that now. So our young men either do it themselves or they replicate those institutions with what they have on hand, right? So if we're talking about gangs for a moment, what are they really? Gangs are the same institutions that are rebuilt without the cultural knowledge systems, without the structures in place, but they are an attempt to rebuild those institutions of manhood preparation that we've lost. And they're often not guided. But that's really where they come from. It's not just a bunch of guys who want to run around and tear up things. It really is an attempt to rebuild a masculine family. And that's that space of initiation that a young man on the continent could experience to bring him into his adulthood. And the women had a very similar thing, and they worked together, right? They worked together in the sense that the women knew at a certain age, my son needs to be taken. The men knew my daughter needs to work with her mother and the women of the community to have an understanding of femininity. We understood those dynamics. We've lost much of that. And so now our televisions raise our children. Our video games do it. And I'm not trying to just go off on that to too great an extreme, but I do want to say the removal of that institution is dangerous, and it has been incredibly problematic for us. So now we're playing catch up, and I'm trying to tell these young men and old ones who still in their 60s and 70s have never had that bond with other men that is both reaffirming, healing, and checking, in the sense that, when you're off point, another man has no problem letting you know that. You know what I mean? And that's a relationship you need, right? But if the only people you deal with are, the people in your immediate household that may depend on you to eat, you're not always going to get checked the way you might need to, and you might not always hear it. But when you got another man sitting with you that doesn't really need anything material from you, he's going to tell you something you may not want to hear. But that's necessary. And those relationships are necessary, and those things that we really have to regain.
Absolutely. Let's take a quick break, and we'll follow up on those points and talk about what needs to be done in terms of establishing those type of support groups. We'll be...
Suffer your every weakness.
Okay, so we're back with Brother Dr. T. Hasan Johnson, and we were talking about relationships, spousal abuse. So before we went on the break, we were talking about, the development, the need to develop support groups for both men and women to deal with, some of the things that we deal with in terms of relating. And we were talking about how in indigenous cultures that was part of the initiatory process, initiating the young male and the young female into manhood, into womanhood. We can even, you and I, were part of a men's group when we were both part of the Aquarian Spiritual Center, and we also similarly had a women's group. So just speak on the need to be able to have that, because I know that particularly in our culture, where many young men are brought up in a household that is primarily female oriented, in one parent household, and that many of us, including myself, didn't really have anything to look forward to in terms of someone who would be able to school us on manhood. And so we, like you said, adopted this image that we picked up from watching things like James Bond or whatever on TV, and adopted that as the idea of what being a man represents.
Well, sure. I mean, we and I try to remind people, because we believe it's always been this way, but it hasn't. It's really in the 1960s and 1970s that you really started to see the removal of black men from homes. Mm-hmm. And that happened in multiple ways. I mean, it happened in regard to the creation of ghettos after World War II. So you had black folk moving from the South up north for jobs. And then when those white soldiers came back, they took their jobs back. And that left a void of black folk in the North without employment, by and large, particularly men who couldn't find employment. Now, when you factor in from there, the federal government stepping in terms of the welfare state, one of the requirements was, in order for you to receive welfare support and housing, was that he couldn't be present in the family.
That's right.
So we're looking at a structured removal of black men from families. Now, there was something you said that I thought was very key when you said we learned about our masculinity from 007 and whatnot. We did. We learned about it from watching Westerns. We learned about it from watching movies and even the blaxploitation movies of the 1970s. The Superflies, and we learned about our masculinity from there, because we lost those institutions where men got together and talked and reaffirmed each other and mentored one another. We lost a lot of that. And so the outcome was we learned how to seduce women, but we did not learn how to be fathers. Many of us didn't see fathers. I mean, my father was a good man, still is a brilliant man, but I didn't see him much. Right. So we did not see on a day-to-day basis what a relationship looked like. There was no assumption that men would be the caretakers of children. That was really never on the table. So by and large, what we learned to do in coming into our manhood was to define our masculinity based on at least two things. One, being able to demonstrate fearlessness. In other words, if I contend with another man, I'm not going to let him dominate me. I'm going to prove my masculinity that way and demonstrate my strength. And that actually does come out of an ancient practice of young men proving that they will not succumb to fear. It's not just machismo, bull. It actually is part of our spiritual development, but it's done outside of the knowledge systems that we came out of. So the first thing was being able to control one's fear. The second thing was in our relationship with women. What we turned it into in our ignorance was how to seduce. But we didn't go much further than that. So I can dress a certain way. You know, I can drive a certain car, I can say certain things, and our women have experienced the same type of oppression we have. They learn to interpret masculinity on some very superficial way, in some very superficial ways as well. So we performed a certain type of masculinity that was attractive and seductive. But when the reality of children, jobs, you know, that post-high school, you know, reality, many of us were not prepared, and black men in particular didn't always have legal means in terms of access to jobs. So, you know, there's a whole industry in the late 70s and 1980s that pops up in black urban communities around the country that are really just, and they're hiring any black male that wants to get involved, and it's an illegal industry. So, you know, when you don't have access to work and the schools are not really talking to you, you go in the industry that's hiring. And especially if it requires no training and it pays well, then where else are most poor black males going to go after the removal of jobs? So we go into the illegal industry, and that became a route straight to prisons. And that's been the cycle ever since. But that cycle has a beginning point. It wasn't always that way. And I say that very purposefully because my students come into my classroom thinking that this is just what it means to be black. And it's what it always has meant. No, this is a very particular construct that came about in the 60s and 70s and does not have to be it does not have to exist. But we first have to recognize it. So we get to this point where we as men have to take responsibility for how we've been dealing with our community and defining our masculinity. But we also have to understand the structures and institutions that have played into our underdevelopment. We have to understand that it isn't just because, you know, we're incapable of taking responsibility. It's because these institutions have been very targeted in terms of how they impact black males. So we don't learn about our role in a family. We don't learn what it means to be there on a day-to-day basis, raising kids, being supportive, so on and so forth. That's not something many of us have ever seen modeled except for on television. And the other thing is marriage and relationships have changed dramatically in the last 70 years. My grandparents and great-grandparents, they didn't get married with this kind of Romeo and Juliet love affair idea. It was an expectation that at a certain age you joined a family, you had kids. You know, the idea of marriage out of love is really a very new idea, especially if you research the differences in Victorian European culture and American culture. The changes over time in what a relationship was and how it was defined wasn't always the same. It changed over time. So we've moved into an era where relationships are more about individual love than they are about family. It's more about this kind of Hollywood whisk you off your feet kind of idea, and it doesn't always prepare you for the difficulty of a 30-year marriage. Because a 30-year marriage is not about, you know, it's not just flowers and romance. It's actually getting your hands dirty and being present to a family that you build over decades. And those are things that many of us didn't get a chance to learn. So those kind of things also begin to impact the black family in all kinds of ways. But in terms of manhood, it's one of the things that mentoring brotherhood relationship helps with. So, Brother Sarah, when you talked about our meeting in the Aquarian and when the men would get together on a weekly basis, for many of us who were fairly young at that time, that was incredibly impactful to have this group of men whose ages ranged, I mean, what would you say, 20s through what?
20s through 50s, indeed, yes.
Oh, yeah, 20s through 50s. You had brothers in that room that could talk to you from all kinds of different experiences. And that's really what we need at this point. We need to be able to build those kind of institutions again, where we can purposely put our sons through that so they have an idea of what role they are to play. And back to the issue of abuse, that they can actually speak out and say to a trusted group of brothers, this is what I'm going through. a room of men that aren't going to laugh at you because your woman hit you in the head with a pot, because that's serious business.
It is.
Or a room full of brothers that you can say, I was sexually violated, whether it was by a man or a woman, and those brothers take you seriously. See, many of us don't have those kind of spaces. You know, when I worked in Philadelphia with young men who were 14 and court ordered to take my class to keep from going back to jail, a third of the room had been sexually violated, and the majority of them had been sexually violated by women. So when they tried to tell their friends, the response was, well, you got some. You know, you had sex. Good. But that didn't feel good to them. It wasn't something they were happy about, but they now knew they couldn't go anywhere for support. So we need these kinds of institutions to provide a level of emotional support that most of us have not had on a regular basis.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's powerful. And in those groups, you know, I would suggest that introducing, you know, the spiritual principles and discussing even how they relate to dealing with relationships. You know, you mentioned, you know, relationship in terms of the group dynamics with the interactions between males, but you know, when you were talking about the institution of marriage, and what gets lost in that is that a marriage is a relationship, you know, and
yes.
And the key word in that is how to relate. And we learn how to relate by using that relationship to be able to reflect upon what's going on within oneself.
Yes.
You know, and so, you know, and that's the relationship then, you know, just functions as a means to be able to, you know, come to a deeper understanding of oneself. You know, and what ends up happening too often is that it ends up being a means to deflect and to blame, which ends up leading to the violence that you're talking about.
Oh, absolutely. And there's a couple of things there that I would just add to that. One, on an individual level, we change and we grow. And many times when we think about a relationship, right, you hear people say, well, I want to get married and be married for 50 years. Do you have any idea how different two people become over 50 years? Over 10, I mean, think about yourself 10 years ago, you know, and how different you are. So a relationship is not just two people being together, sharing space. Right. It's two people growing together because we constantly change. But the other thing I want to add to that is the expectations on us in society change as well. And see, this is one of the things I would like to discuss more in gender classes, that the idea of what it means to be a man has changed dramatically in the last century. My grandfather's generation, he wasn't expected to be consoling to his children, emotionally supportive. No. The expectation on him was that he provided and protected. That was the two things that men were expected to do.
That's right.
If your family was threatened, you were prepared to do something about it. And in terms of making sure they ate, that it was expected of you to go do that. Now, I'm not saying that all black men did do that or were able to do it, but I am saying that the expectation that they do it was still there, and it's still there to this day.
That's right.
You know, I mean, I've dated women who make 3 times as much as I do, and they'll look you dead in the eye and tell you in a minute, you know, I want a man who's going to, you know, take care of me. And you say, well, what does that mean? Well, financially, you know, I've had women quit their jobs on the expectation that I'm going to provide, even though she makes 3 times more than I do. The expectation that men provide is still very strong. But the difference is, as we saw a rise in women's narratives and experiences in the 60s and 70s, the expectation of men began to change. And the expectation became, we need you to be loving and supportive and emotionally present. Well, our fathers and grandfathers didn't come from those expectations.
Not at all.
So that transition we're still grappling with that. But the problem is, as men, we don't talk about it. We just adapt to it, you know, and that's part of the problem. Women have talked about this amongst themselves. Men have not. Men, we've just learned new ways of trying to seduce, but we haven't really talked about these changes, and they are dramatic, and they're not lightweight changes at all. So to go from provide and protect to provide, protect, emotionally nurture, and be present, there's a lot more that comes with that wasn't there in the past. And so we need to be able to talk about these changing expectations on men and what they mean, because there isn't a conversation happening about that, particularly in the black community. There's a conversation amongst black women about what it means to be a woman and what is and isn't happening, but men are not having that conversation, and we desperately need to.
Well, absolutely. And you pointed out all of those new conditions and expectations that have been placed, but then it's not balanced with recognizing the increased pressures that a black man has, as you were talking about, how more difficult it is now to be able to have employment in order to be in a position to be able to be a provider. And then, so you're going through these pressures of just being able to survive as a black man in the society, and then also being expected to come home and nurture and listen, and who's going to listen and do that for us? And
we need to start by doing it with ourselves, because that's going to be key. So when you talk about issues of employment, you'll hear people say, well, why is that an issue? Men make more money than women, don't they? Well, if you look at a percentage of men that are in elite spaces, they do. But whether you're talking about the black community or the larger community, there have always been 10 times more impoverished men than there ever were elite wealthy men.
Right.
And that's especially in the black community. When you look at this population of homeless people, they are overwhelmingly men. Right? That when you look at the incarcerated numbers, especially in the black community, they are overwhelmingly men. These are men that do not make very much money and never have. That's at right. Least, and especially legally. You know what I mean? So these kinds of conversations need to happen, because now the question is, if I'm still expected to protect and provide, and yet I'm in a system that is actively disinterested in seeing me do well, how do I negotiate that? What does it mean? If I do want to, for example, be a stay-at-home father and my wife work, does that make me less than a man? And I asked that question to groups that I talk to, and it's interesting because men will shy away from the question, women will applaud it. But this is where it gets interesting. Your man is a stay-at-home father for, say, 3 to 5 years. The way we've been trained to see gender, even women that will applaud the idea of that will find herself less attracted to a man who's not living up this traditional masculinity. So in other words,
absolutely,
even though she may applaud in concept the idea of this loving, supportive, stay-at-home father, the traditional expectation on men will still play out, and she may find herself losing attraction. And that becomes a very interesting part of the conversation when I hear women who will applaud the idea say, well, yeah, I got to be honest, it does change. I need a man that can do this. I need a man that can fix my car. I need a man that's physically strong and has a 12-pack set of abs. I need a man that makes $300,000 a year, so I don't have to worry. And yet I want him to cook and clean and take care of the kids. Well, okay.
Right. And so in other words, they want a real man.
It becomes an interesting kind of back and forth that men have to do. But again, we're not talking to each other about these expectations, because that was one of the most powerful things about the feminist movement is women were comparing notes. That was really, when they sat down and said, wait a minute, what are you dealing with at home? Because this is what I'm dealing with. And that conversation advanced into policy. Right? So to this day, if you say, I want to look up what domestic abuse policies are, they are overwhelmingly geared for women. And it came out of these conversations women had with each other. When's the last time you heard of a male rape crisis number? Or a male rape crisis a border home that you could go to in the middle of the night if you had to leave You don't hear about those things. Those are conversations that men have not had, nor have they evolved into policy yet. We need to be able to have conversations about what we are experiencing, because these changing expectations of masculinity and the impact of various kinds of attitudes in terms of abuse on men and relationships, these things need to be discussed, because if they're not, we will continue to experience them hopping from one foot to another and not being able to understand why we can't ever seem to make it work. Well, that's a lot there that we have to deal with.
Absolutely. So if you were to just come up with, say, 3 to 5 principles that need to be put in place and implemented, what would you boil that down to?
Oh my goodness. I think one of the first, especially since we're talking about abuse and violence in intimate settings, the first thing I would say is that men are vulnerable human beings. The idea of men is this invulnerable individual who can take anything, but men as human beings are vulnerable human beings. We too need support. We too can be abused. We too can experience severe amounts of pain, but because we may not express it the same way women have been cultivated to express it, doesn't mean it isn't there, right? So we definitely need to be able to first start with that. Men are human beings that can experience pain. And it sounds so basic, but you'd be surprised how many students have a revelation in my classes by the end of the semester that, wow, men are human beings. It's amazing to kind of hear. So I would start there. And I'm trying to think of, you're talking about just principles about men in society, right?
Yeah, principles or even things that need to be put into practice, like what you were talking about, having a men's group. Well,
I would add to that if we were to talk about issues of, say, divorce, that men do need to be taken seriously when it comes to abuse, when it comes to being in the lives of your children, when it comes to child support. These things need to be talked about in far more humane ways. In the sense that if you have someone who wants to be and has always been in the life of his children and yet goes to court to deal with issues of child support, custody, it's become far more prevalent than people think that men are not supposed to be associated with their kids. But there are plenty of men that want to, and this is a discussion that we need to have on a larger scale basis. The access to family is something that I think is important. I think it's also important for us to look at the changing definitions of masculinity over time and what impact that's had. Right, so that we can have a better understanding of how to measure the quality of a man and what he brings to the table, because that definition of valued quality has changed from one thing to another, and it's consistently changing. So we have to be sure that we're not measuring the men in our lives by an unfair, unrealistic standard that is no longer, up to date. And
Absolutely.
We need to be able to have a conversation about what these changes look like. Because men themselves don't know what they look like, right? So that's another area that we need to be able to look at. But those are just a couple that come right off there about what kinds of changes we need to look at.
Okay, and in terms of I think you mentioned before needing to have a more of a movement or an advocacy in order to be able to bring into focus some of those issues, in the same way that there was a feminist movement to bring to light some of the issues that women had to face. Given this new paradigm of violence against men, do you feel as though some advocacy needs to be put in place at this point?
Oh, absolutely, because I think, and I think one of the more critical points is we need to actually define what violence to men looks like. See, because again, in the article, I have a picture that says a man is abused every 14.6 seconds, and you see a picture of a gentleman with a black eye. And that the one problem I have with the poster is that that's the prevailing idea of what we have about being abused, right? That you have these black eyes and these busted lips, but there are all kinds of abuse, and even physical abuse doesn't look the same. One of the things I found out in my research is that when it comes to abuse, men do more visible damage, but women hit more. Mm-hmm. There are studies that show that women actually initiate violence more often than men, but men do more damage. So again, by the time the police show up or your friends see you, she may look worse. But it doesn't mean that he didn't have to deal with something on his end. What we need to be able to do in having these conversations is actually look at the standards we have for acceptable conduct in a relationship and really define what violence against men looks like. See, most men, and I remember this growing up, when you talked about a woman throwing something at you or hitting you, men talking to other men, the idea was, well, that's just what relationships are. You just got to deal with that. Mm-hmm. You know, that's just be a man, suck it up. That's just what you deal with. Nobody ever said that if she hits you with a pot of hot grits, that's actually abuse. Mm-hmm. I never heard the word abuse associated with men in terms of being victims until I was at least 35 years old. I never heard the term abuse applied to women in regard to men on the experiencing end of it. And that's a problem. And that's why we don't actually hear about it more often, because most of us, even those that have experienced it or witnessed it, don't interpret it as abuse. You know, when you were mentioning the friend of yours that you saw being abused, did in that conversation with him, did the word abuse ever come up?
No, not at all.
Oh. But if you have two women and she's being beat up on a regular basis, you can believe that that's come up. And it's not because women are this or that. It's because they've had a conversation over the decades and they've begun to implement policy that makes sure that we in the populace understand that violence towards women is unacceptable and it's abuse. Now, it still happens. There's no question about that. But we at least have a framework for interpreting that. The problem with male abuse is we don't have a framework for interpreting that. So when men get abused, men themselves will not consider it abuse.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's right. You know, and you know, particularly, you know, based upon the perception of what it is to be a male, to be masculine, you know, creates a dichotomy where you don't want to discuss it in that light, you know, because mm-hmm. you don't want to be considered to be not masculine. Like in that situation with my friend, this is a brother who was a football player, you know, mm-hmm. so for just, you know, and you know how ultra masculine, you know, that realm is, you know, so for a brother like that to, you know, express being a victim of abuse would be contrary to that type of mentality. Exactly.
And unfortunately, what that guarantees is that it can go on unchecked. Mm-hmm. And she doesn't have to be held accountable, right? So, and I go back to the Jay-Z Solange video because it was something that struck people, you know, in terms of how Solange kind of attacked Jay-Z in an elevator. But in reality, when we look at that, I like to ask people, what exactly would Jay-Z do if he didn't have a bodyguard in the elevator holding her? Mm-hmm. She's kicking and punching and, you know, if able to, throwing things at him if she could have got her hands on something. Mm-hmm. What exactly does he do? If he responds physically, it's abuse. If he doesn't, he's assaulted. Mm-hmm. You know, but so I try and really get people to have this conversation. What can you do? What are your options? And you're absolutely right. For men, especially those who are athletes, who are in a culture of hyper masculinity, coming forward can actually be damaging to their careers on some levels, depending mm-hmm. on what a man does, right?
Absolutely.
So that can be a problem, but it leaves men with no option. And at some point, and this is why I keep coming back to policy, men have to be able to talk to each other and eventually be able to develop policy in the sense that we can make sure when the word abuse or domestic violence or rape is mentioned, it doesn't immediately suggest that this is a woman who's the victim and a man who's an aggressor. It can be a man who is a victim as well and a woman who's an aggressor. And that has not entered the popular consciousness yet.
That's an exceptional point. That's absolutely true. I wanted to make the suggestion as well, because we talked about, the word relationship, and to have a relationship requires two people. So we need to have a men's group where men can discuss these issues. We need to have a women's group and women to be able to discuss the issues and be able to relate to each other and express the issues. We also need to be able to have a forum where we can all come together and discuss it together. Absolutely. But unfortunately, the way it kind of works now, even in, the gender classes that I work with, you'll have women having a conversation and men sitting silently. Mm-hmm. And this has been my major thesis for the longest. Men do not have a vocabulary for talking about gender. So when I teach a class, the women come in with a vocabulary. Mm. And really my students now, you got to figure, when Bush took office in 2000, they were 3-4 years old. Mm-hmm. So they're actually coming from generations of women's dialogue. Mm. So they've never sat in a class on feminism. They probably couldn't name a black feminist if you paid them, but they do have a vocabulary for talking about their experience as women and what it means. The men will sit silently if they take the class at all. And then when we come together to have a larger conversation, guess who's talking and guess who isn't? Not only are the men unprepared to talk, but the women have actually been able to talk in that room prior to the conversation. So when you say that we need to be able to come together, you're absolutely right. But it's critical that men learn how to talk about their experience, not only as black, but as black men, or as men general if they're not black at all. They need to be able to have these conversations, develop the vocabulary to express their experiences. And then you'll find that when men and women get together, because we do this every spring, I created in the Africana Studies Department at Fresno State a Black Gender Conference. So my colleague, Dr. Deanna Reese, teaches the women's class. I teach the black male class. And then in the conference, they get together and have a conversation. And you'd be surprised how different the conversation goes when both groups have been introduced to each other's experiences. See, the idea people have now is that black men's only experience is as aggressors, is as violent kind of offenders, as privileged. This idea that men are privileged and that's just the end of the discussion. That's what people come in with. But when you actually can talk to people and say, look, in terms of violence, black men are victims of violence as well, not only from the police state, not only from the federal government, but also in our own communities, from each other as black men, and sometimes from our women, in much higher numbers than people think. When you're able to have that conversation, it turns black men from being just these violent offenders into human beings. And when you're able to say, not only have I been a victim of violence, but I can also talk about this idea of privilege, because for every brother that's a CEO, for the 5 of them that you can name, there are far more of them in prison. That's right. And when we talk about the rates of black male pay, we never account for the thousands of black men that are incarcerated. And considering that those black men make an average of $7 a week, one of the things that I push to do is to actually include that what I would call negative income in the statistics about black male earnings. And then let's ask the question again about black male pay rates. But my point here is simply that when you include all of those elements to our experience that are not talked about, then it changes the conversation. And then the conversation goes from accusatory and angry to how can we work together? It changes the tone of the conversations. But when one group has been speaking and the other group has been silent, it doesn't work. That's absolutely true. And I'm sure that that's a dynamic many of us experience in our relationship. So with that, brother, we're coming to a close on the show. and I want you to alert our listeners to how they can access that article again.
Well, if they can, there's a series of articles, but the latest one is the Stephen A. Smith article on the domestic abuse of men, and you can find it at New Black Masculinities, plural, newblackmasculinities.wordpress.com, and that's where you'll find it.
Okay. Now, I want to thank you, brother, for joining us. It was a powerful discussion. I liked your interview, and I liked the article that you read, and I encourage all of our listeners to read that, and I appreciate the perspective that you brought on this issue.
Well, thank you, brother, for having me. Hotep.
Absolutely.